Hello and welcome everyone. Thanks for logging into today's Flight Cancelled webinar. We hope you're all travelling COVID safe. I'm Flight Free crew member Mark Carter. First up, I want to acknowledge that we meet today on the land of Australia's First Nations and that their sovereignty over this land has never been ceded. We pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the pivotal role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people continue to play within the Australian community. This webinar is hosted by Flight Free Australia. We're part of the global network of groups campaigning to raise awareness of aviation's contribution to the climate crisis. We're a member of the International Stay Grounded Network based in Vienna and a member of Flight Free World, along with groups in Sweden, the UK, US and Slovenia. All of us campaigning for people to pledge to not fly for a year. And helping me out today in Tassie is Flight Free Australia crew member Helen Hutchinson. Now there's a few housekeeping things I should run through. We're recording the webinar and we'll be adding some useful URL links through the chat button at the bottom of your screen. And you can put your questions to panelists through clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And can we apologise in advance for any technical hitches we meet along the way today. We hope you'll all find our discussion today engaging. We're really fortunate to have on our panel Margaret, Klein, Salamon joining us from the US and 3 flight-free pledges here in Oz. We'll kick off with stories from them, Charlie, David and Uma, on their personal journeys to pledging and beyond. After them, Margaret, who some of you will know from last year's National Climate Emergency Summit, will talk about how making choices like pledging to not fly can help build the movement to make zero emissions and massive drawdown the #1 priority of economics and politics. But before we get to our panelists, can I give a quick set of context notes, especially for those of you unfamiliar with the issue. First, where do we stand with global emissions overall? Well, our emissions are growing. 1.2 degrees of warming is imminent. 1.5 degrees is now likely by 2030. 2 degrees could trigger further warming beyond our control. And up to 2.4 degrees of warming is possible even if emissions stop today. So it's clear we need to, at emergency speed, both cut emissions to zero and draw down those emissions up there that could already push us to 2.4 degrees. In this context, what's aviation doing? Well, emissions-free flying isn't possible at scale for decades at the earliest. Meanwhile, aviation emissions are 3 times more warming than the industry admits. And by 2050, they'll be a quarter of all emissions if Paris reduction commitments are achieved. Flying is actually the most warming single thing you can do. Yes, COVID has cut flying, but the emissions reductions it's delivered will make no difference if we return to flying as normal. So there's a necessity to stop flying, but is it possible? Most of us aren't flying right now anyway because of the virus, but is it possible to stop flying for the climate? Well, Uma, David and Charlie are here today to say that it is, and maybe inspire us to do likewise. First up is Charlie Mcgee in Perth. Charlie was, I think, Flight Free Oz pledger #1. He's also a permaculture advocate, musician and founder of the WA permaculture funk band Formidable Vegetable. Thanks for rising early for us, Charlie.
No worries. Yeah, it's good to be here. Coming to you from Wajak Noongar Budja, which is the traditional people of this country, and I want to acknowledge the Noongar people and that we're also on stolen land over here. You know, it's been a bit of a journey. Well, it's been a lack of a journey actually for the past year of lockdown, and it's so interesting because I guess as a musician, I've gone from being a jet-setting, world-traveling, festival-going, maniac to playing everywhere from, Glastonbury in the UK to Shambhala in Canada, and then through the States and Europe and all over the place, and forgetting which hemisphere I'm even in, to 2020's lockdown in Victoria, where I ended up for 10 months on a permaculture farm, which was actually such a blessing. And, really, really just got me to experience firsthand a lot of the things that I've been singing about. And it's been this tension between, in a band, being in a band that sings about permaculture. Formidable Vegetable is my band, and we've been touring around promoting sustainability and low carbon living and regenerative culture and things like that, because I see a need for us to really make systemic change, to promote these ideas into the mainstream so that governments and corporations adopt them and make policy about them. But at the same time, I had this tension around not doing it myself. And I was like, it just, in the end, it got too much. And when the 1.5 degree report came out from the IPCC back in, I think, late 2018 or 2019, when I read it, I just thought enough's enough. And I was on tour in New Zealand at the moment, at the time. And as I was leaving this festival that we were at, there was this huge heat wave coming through the South Island of New Zealand. And the grass, which is normally green and fluffy and, kind of like Middle Earth, as you sort of, idyllic sort of thing that you see in the movies, it just dried out and was crispy and dusty. And it felt like central Victoria in the height of summer. And of course, the heat had come over from Victoria and Tasmania, and actually all the way from Western Australia, where the heat wave originated. And it was this massive event that desiccated the landscape, went across the Tasman. The oceans weren't cool enough to draw down the heat and bring the cooler weather, and it just blasted the South Island of New Zealand and set the whole place on fire. When I left the festival, there were wildfires raging through the Golden Bay region, and no one there was prepared for it. People just didn't know what to do in a bushfire, because bushfires don't often happen in the South Island of New Zealand. And after having read the report and starting to wake up around the climate reality and experiencing this firsthand, I just had this pang of like grief and panic, and was like, wow, what am I going to do? I can't keep on contributing to this. So I got back to Australia and immediately pledged to not fly for our upcoming European tour. And that meant, in the end, having to cancel it. And we had invitations to play again at Glastonbury Festival, which is one of the world's biggest music events, and at such cool places as Svalbard in the Arctic Circle, where they're doing the northernmost permaculture project, and all of these amazing sustainability events. But I just couldn't reconcile it with my personal actions anymore. And it was a tricky situation, and it was a journey to kind of work through. But, since making that decision, and I think back in October 2019, I took the Flight Free pledge with Flight Free Oz, and I haven't flown since, and it's actually been fantastic. And then in 2020, obviously with COVID and lockdown, hey, flight free everywhere, pretty much. I mean, there's still a handful left, but we actually ended up playing at Glastonbury, ironically, via Zoom. So it was sort of, nothing was lost in the end. I mean, except for the obvious. But I mean, I'd love to play a song, actually, because music is my main medium for communication, and I think for me, music is a much more effective way of communicating than, say, kind of throwing out hard science and stats. I mean, nothing against hard science and stats. I mean, you guys are great, but I'm not that kind of communicator. And I've really found that through music, people can kind of get an emotional connection, and they can get drawn in to the stories and the song. And traditional cultures have been telling stories like this for millennia. So when I studied permaculture 10 years ago, which is what a lot of my songs are about, the regenerative design framework, sort of synthesized by David Holmgren and Bill Mollison, I started looking into a lot of traditional ways of communicating, and a lot of that was through songs and the arts. And I was like, why don't we bring that back? So into Western culture at least. So I think for me, the theme song of 2020 was this one, which I wrote in my first album, Permaculture, A Rhymer's Manual. If you ever wanted to learn about permaculture and couldn't be bothered reading a book, then maybe that's for you. But because it was the great slowing down. In fact, in about a week before COVID in February 2020, the BBC World Service rang me up and had a little chat about why we weren't coming to Glastonbury. And as well as the carbon emissions factor, I told them that world travel was just messing with my head. It was too fast and furious, and I didn't know where or who I was anymore. And I said, you know, if there was one world movement that I could start, I would call it the Great Slowing Down. And careful what you wish for, because 1 week later, that's exactly what happened. So this one's called Small and Slow. In the future, when we run out of fossil fuel energy, how are we gonna feed everybody and still have enough for you and me? Well, life today seems pretty good, like we came out on top. But I wonder how we're gonna get down. We gotta be careful we don't drop. Just take it slow. Make it small and slow to avoid the confusion. Use a small and slow solution. Yeah. For instance, in your front yard, you can grow most of your food in a space the size of your driveway. It doesn't have to be huge. Just plant a seed, watch it grow. It'll feed you, just let it go. You don't want the pain of too much to maintain, so just stay inside the right size and take it slow. Make it small and slow. Don't need the green revolution when you've got a small and slow solution. Yeah. 'Cause bigger isn't always better, and faster doesn't make it stronger. And if we keep going the way we're going, well, we won't be around for much longer. So instead of running towards a brick wall, why not walk instead and save your head? 'Cause the bigger it is, the harder it's gonna fall. So just keep it small and take it slow. Because that dream of unlimited growth, I'm afraid to say that's just a popular delusion. So use a small and slow solution. Yeah. So yeah, that was just the you know, that's kind of a reminder to kind of take it chill. And for ages, I was all talk and no walk. You know, it was all fly and drive. So you know, the last year has really helped me to kind of come good on that and get back to the garden, get back to growing food, get back to creating the kind of world I want to see, like in this new kids book by David Holmgren that we helped put out. It's kind of taking pleasure in doing things on the home front, and you know, getting back to the backyard and the front yard. And I guess we've all had a big opportunity to do that. But when we are traveling, finding alternative ways to do it. And one way that I've always loved to do, I don't know if I've got time for one more song. No? All right. Well, next time. Anyway, thanks for having me. We'll run out of time, I think. So back to you, Mark.
Thanks, Charlie. That was brilliant. I was just thinking your story gives a whole new meaning to that phrase. Those three words, work, life, balance. Good stuff. Let's now hand over to David, joining us from Brisbane. Professor David Hood is inaugural Beyond Zero Emissions Fellow and engineering champion, and a civil and environmental engineer for more than 35 years. Welcome, David.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I'm coming to you from Meanjin country, which is Brisbane, and I pay my respects to the elders, the Throttle people, and they're even now and emerging elders. I want to share my screen to take you through some of the reasons why I have committed to not flying as much as I can. Now, when I say this, it's actually, I'll just go back one. It's actually hard to say that you're not going to fly because I'm on a few boards and you know, sometimes I have to appear face to face, but if I can catch the train, I will. What I'm saying here is that, I'll just move this out of the way. Why must we throttle back the aviation industry urgently? Aviation is probably the most unsustainable industry that we've ever developed. And my career started in the Air Force as a civil engineer building runways for fighter jets. Very unsustainable. I got sick of orders and the rigidity of it, and I resigned, went over to civil aviation. I was responsible for the Darwin Airport's new terminal on the north side. I did a bit of planning on master planning of the Perth airport, but my main project was director planning development of Sydney Airport. And when I look down at that shot there, I can see a couple of the taxiways, some of the terminal developments, and this parallel runway that I got Wal Fife to announce back before Bob Hawke went around the suburbs and said, vote for us and we'll stop that runway, which of course they did, but it was built not quite where I was going to put it during the Labor years. I then shifted my career over to facilities management, took over this Parliament House building in Canberra. And I couldn't believe how inefficient that building was. The brief said no new technology. So when I took the building over, it was 25 years old. And we started to import energy efficiency and change a lot of the systems in the building. And in fact, we were able to save 40% of the electricity after the first full year of operation. So that was a big aha moment, as Al Gore calls it, where your career changes. And I just got deeper and deeper from that aviation sort of sector into energy efficiency and sustainability in the built environment. When the building was running properly, I went back to aviation. I was the General Manager Marketing Development of the Civil Aviation Authority, commercializing intellectual property that was developed, products, software, consulting services worldwide. So back to a lot of flying. And you can see that's what sort of got to me about this flying. Dick Smith, my old mate, was the chairman, and I had a big fight with him and resigned because he wanted to shut out all the engineering and technical people. Last year, I had the great privilege of the 3-day Climate Emergency Summit, and just a few things I wanted to mention from the communique they put out. One of the first things is Australians must collectively have a duty of care to protect people, nature, civilization, both locally and globally. And then there are points that they prioritised: cutting greenhouse gas emissions rapidly to zero, drawing down atmospheric carbon concentration to a safe level, working to prevent the tipping points as we move to zero emissions, and integrating and adapting resilience measures into the economic transformation that we need. And one of the things that came out was that we must move far faster than we're doing now, using the measures appropriate to an existential threat. It is an emergency that we have. Some pretty heavy hitters signed on to that. I won't go through them, but what really gets my passion going is this beautiful granddaughter of mine. And at 1 week old, she looked up at me and said, "Grandpa, is this CO2 thing really serious?" She's now 11. She will still be alive at the end of this century. And that's the sort of thing that really worries me. What sort of world are we leaving her? So in my talks, I often use this picture here. And I ask the audience, what is this thing down here? And they say, "Oh, David, that's an airplane." "Yeah, no, I think it's a 747, someone says. Well, I call it a tube of congealed electricity. And you'll find out why on the next couple of slides. And then I want to talk a little bit about, what is this coming out of the plane? And that sort of, when I look at that and think about it, that really gets me thinking about why do we fly? So how do you make aluminium? And this is something that a lot of people don't sort of know and realize. Well, the very first thing is we mine bauxite, which is the ore in Weipa. I'm just using this as an example in Cape York. And then we ship it in huge container ships around to Kwinana, where there's a refinery, and the bauxite is converted to aluminum oxide or alumina, and a lot of red mud, which is stored just outside Kwinana, and they don't know what to do with it. Greenhouse gases in mining, greenhouse gases in shipping, all the way to Kwinana, enormous greenhouse gases in the refining. And what do we do with the alumina? We put it in a bulk carrier again, and we take it over to Maputo for smelting. And again, greenhouse gases all the way across. These ships burn dirty oil, a dreadful pollutant in the atmosphere. So what happens when it gets to Maputo? It goes into the smelter, the Moselle Smelter. There's the Moselle Smelter just outside Maputo at Matola, and it's in these 1.5 kilometre long sheds where the smelting occurs. In those sheds are huge pots where the alumina is raised to 1,000 degrees, it's melted down, and then you pass a current through it of about 4 to 6 volts, 3,000 amps. That's approximately 15 megawatts per ton of aluminium is consumed. And all that electricity, of course, in Mozambique is from coal-fired electricity from South Africa. Now, what happens, they put a carbon anode into the molten alumina, and the anode is also either a carbon lining on the pot. And when the current flows through, the carbon grabs the oxygen and the aluminium drops out the bottom. But what happens to the carbon dioxide? It comes out as a gas. The industry doesn't tell you that. That diagram is from the industry, and you can't see the mention of CO2 in that diagram. So approximately 12 to 15 tons of CO2 per ton of aluminium comes out of the smelter, of each pot, to make 1 ton of aluminium. So then the bugger flies at 30 to 40,000 feet, burning fossil fuels and emitting more CO2, NOxes, and heaps of water. And that's what you see, condensed water there in the vapor trails, the contrails, the aircraft. But it's a lot of CO2 comes out as well in the burning of the fuels, the fossil fuels in that aircraft. And of course, the greenhouse gases, of which water is one, at that altitude, between 2.8 and 3.2 times worse at the radiative forcing of infrared than in the lower atmosphere. Now, a lot of data here that you can go back to this, it's being recorded, and check on these figures. So it's sort of looks back on my career in the aviation industry and all the flying I've done. And it's seriously embarrassing to me. I've been flying for more than 5,000 hours in domestic, international, and military aircraft. Over 6 months continuous, sitting in an aircraft at 30 to 40,000 feet, spewing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And I did the calculation yesterday. That's 4,800,000 kilometers that I've flown. Or if you like, that's 6 times to the moon and back. So that's one of the reasons when I look back at my embarrassing career, why I have chosen to go flight free. And my commitment is to do it wherever possible. Sometimes I may just have to hop on an airplane for urgency, medical emergencies, etc. So Mark, that's my story about going flight free. Back to you, Mark.
Thanks, David. For a tech change guy, your behaviour change message is so very important and powerful. Now let's hear Uma's story. Uma Dingemans is a musician and first-year art student at Melbourne Uni. Last year, she joined the Flight Free Australia pledge and also created the online petition against what was then Qantas's crazy flights to nowhere.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, Uma.
Great. Good morning, everyone. I'm really excited to be here, so thank you for having me. First off, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people and their elders past, present and emerging. So first off, I'll just give you a bit of a lowdown on my life, my experience with flying. So I started flying very young. I have family in the US. So my first flight was probably at about 4 years old, and I've done that a few more times. And I've also been to Europe and New Zealand. So I've racked up a few flight hours there, which I'm not super proud of. But fast forward to last year, I was doing year 12 in the middle of the pandemic, which was hard. But, you know, in between my school lectures, which weren't very engaging, I was scrolling through Instagram. I went onto Qantas's Instagram site and I saw this thing, this flight, this new flight from Sydney, a 7-hour flight back to Sydney. So no stop-offs. And I was thinking, this is strange. I did some research and I created a petition on change.org called Ban Nowhere Flights. So essentially this flight was a way for Qantas to continue flying and for people to spend money to get flying again, but there was no purpose. There was no purpose at all, and it really angered me. So I created this petition. We got about 800 signatures, which I was really proud of. And I thought, how can I promote this petition that I've made? And I discovered this great organization called Flight Free Oz. And I reached out to them, and it turns out it was Mark. And Mark and I live really close by to each other, like a 5-minute drive. So then I became involved with Flight Free Oz, and I pledged. So yeah, I'm really glad that I've pledged. And I mean, it's pretty easy in 2020 and 2021. There's no flying anyway, so it's not that much of a change. But when I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about today, I've come up with 3 things that I think are important. So firstly, I want us to all challenge our ideas of if we really need to fly or not. I think what David was saying, he might still need to fly occasionally. That's completely understandable. But a lot of the time people fly when there's no need for it. They don't really need to do it. So we just need to stop. And the pandemic has forced us to do that, but we need to continue that after the pandemic. Secondly, we need to plan. Every time I went overseas, we would go for about 6 weeks. So it wasn't flying in, staying a week and flying back. So just thinking about take a longer holiday if you can, rather than heaps of small ones. That's an easy way to get your flight hours down. So that kind of relates to international travel more. But my third thing is researching. So there's so many options. Once you get to a country or interstate travel, we don't need to fly from Melbourne to Sydney. There are trains, just take them. They're there. The more we take them, the more money those industries will have to improve their services. So get onto it. So yeah, those are my main thoughts. And relating back to Charlie talking about being a musician and flying, I'm also a musician. I haven't had the chance to perform at amazing festivals like that, but I do really enjoy attending festivals. And last year I went to WOMAD, and I made the decision to catch the bus from Melbourne to Adelaide, while a lot of my friends took a plane. And I personally thought it was a lot better. It was a much more enjoyable trip. We got to see, the countryside changing as we traveled along. So those are my 3 main things, just encouraging people to just stop, plan. It doesn't take that long. Just think about it. We live in a world where everything's so accessible and quick, but just taking that extra time can really help the planet, help the environment. And yeah, it's just the right thing to do. So that's why I've pledged. And that's all I really have to say. I have a lot more time left in my allotted slot, but I'm going to pass over to Margaret now. So thank you for having me.
Thanks, Uma. Yeah, those three key points are so important. I was thinking about your petition, and with you now at uni, we could, this is just between you and me really, maybe later we could talk about a petition to reform university travel policy, getting departments and academics in general to address flying restraint. That's a sort of a default part of their culture. Anyway, let's talk about that later, maybe. Can I remind attendees that we'll be going to the Q&A shortly, so remember to put up your questions to panelists there. Thanks. Now we welcome Margaret Klein Salamon, zooming in from the US East Coast. Margaret's a clinical psychologist turned climate activist. She's founder and president of the board of the US Climate Mobilisation, and she's written the radical self-help guide, Facing the Climate Emergency, How to Transform Yourself with Climate Truth. You got to read it if you haven't already. And Margaret has just launched a new project, Climate Awakening. Good evening to you over there, Margaret.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I have a little kind of a mini presentation here. So I'm sharing my screen. Can you see it? Okay, so I wanted to, as Mark said, I'm a clinical psychologist, and I wanted to provide kind of put going flight free into a psychological context. One of the key elements of my work for years has been about the idea of emergency mode. The idea that there are psychologically and sociologically just two fundamentally different ways of operating in normal mode or emergency mode. And this can, an individual, in institution like university or a company or an NGO, and a government can be in either one of these modes. And I have argued that the role of the climate movement is to lead the public into emergency mode, which means enter it ourselves and then bring others along. So as you can see from this little chart, some of the characteristics of emergency mode are huge focus and solving the emergency the overriding priority. Like if your house is on fire, you put aside the other stuff that you're doing, even if it's really important, and focus on securing safety. You allocate all available resources towards the solution rather than in normal mode where you use resources across priorities. And then also the idea of who am I and what makes me a good and respectable and worthwhile person in an emergency. We think, okay, that has to be about contributing. So this idea of emergency mode, the climate mobilization advocates, and there's some wonderful Australian organizations that have also been real leaders in this movement, but advocate for a World War II scale response, a World War II scale climate mobilization, because that was the last time that the US government really recognized, the government and society recognized that this is an existential threat. We're all in danger and we need to just do everything that we can, rapidly transform our society and economy to achieve safety. Okay, but there's this huge barrier to emergency mode right now, and that is pluralistic ignorance. So this is the idea that humans evaluate risk socially, not rationally. And what's happening right now with the climate is pluralistic ignorance, that when we're not sure whether a situation is an emergency or not, we look around and see what other people are doing. So for example, if you're in a room that's slowly filling up with smoke, but everybody around you is just acting normal and fine with it and calm, then it's amazing. I mean, psychological experimentation shows people really sit there as the room fills up with smoke. But if one person enters emergency mode, right? If one person says, oh my gosh, there's smoke, then this is a whole different ballgame, and how people assess risk and emergency changes. Okay, so if climate change really is an existential threat to all of us and all life, and it's really an emergency, then the way to show your fellow Australians, your neighbors, your friends, your colleagues, the way to show them that you view this as an emergency is to act like it, right? This is not a good, do as I say, not as I do situation, right? This is a situation where we're communicating with each other, again, either by acting like it's emergency or not acting normal. So one of the things I talk about and recommend to every single person is to talk about the climate emergency, to talk about it, and also to do that from an emotional perspective. I feel scared. What do you feel when you look at the future, right? that's something that everyone can and should do, because silence is very toxic and destructive, and makes us enhances pluralistic ignorance. But so talking about it, but also again, demonstrating with your actions that you're in emergency mode. So the number one thing to me is about your time. And joining this movement and working for this movement. I know that somebody's really for real when they say something to me like, I've gone to 4 days a week at my job. I've decided to delay my master's degree for a year or whatever. When you're starting to rearrange your life around this idea and this mission to be a part of the movement, giving away money is a good way to show that you're serious, as long as you are also public about it. Anonymous donations wouldn't help fight pluralistic ignorance. And then, of course, some of these major lifestyle changes, such as going flight free, and some other lifestyle changes that people are interested in are like veganism and zero waste. I think going flight free has the greatest carbon impact, or going child free or whatever. But there's different. So these major life changes that people can make, they demonstrate to others that you're in emergency mode, right? If you tell your friends and your family and your colleagues that, sorry, I'm not flying anymore. I'm not flying anymore recreationally, for example, that gives you something to talk about. That's like a launching point for a conversation. So I just want to, I emphasize that in all of this activism, for especially going flight free, you really amplify your impact by talking with other people about it. It would be a real mistake to make that kind of major life change and just keep it to yourself. So I also wanted to ask some provocative questions around kind of thinking really, really big, and this is from my book, is like, what if solving the climate emergency is why you're here? What if it's the mission that you've been born to fulfill? Just to think about your life that way can really put some things in perspective. And then finally, I wanted to just invite everyone to join. As Mark said, my new initiative is Climate Awakening. We're offering small group sharing and listening sessions about the climate emergency, where people talk emotionally with each other, and early participants have really found it very useful. And many people feel alone and alienated about the climate emergency, and like not entirely sure, because of pluralistic ignorance, if you feel that this is an emergency, but you see, everyone else acting normal, and can make people like not be totally certain in their convictions. So anyway, you're all invited. It's a lot to process emotionally and personally. So this is a resource. And I'll pass it back to you, Mark.
Fantastic. Thanks, Margaret. I'm reinvigorated, and I hope listeners are too. That's the big pictures. It's important in all our individual decisions to sort of connect, to have purpose is to connect to the big picture of where we are as a species, as a civilization on the planet. Thanks for your piece. We now have about 10 minutes, I think, maybe 15 minutes left for your questions. Thanks to those of you who've put them up in the Q&A. Helen's been sorting them for us. So I might hand over to her now. Thanks, Helen.
Thanks so much for all those wonderful presentations. I was torn between trying to look at the questions that were going up and listening to what you say, but I know that I can hear this later on, so that's a plus. First of all, I'd like to ask Margaret, at lunch with friends, I mentioned the idea of not flying and everyone went quiet. What can I say to get past that brick wall or anger to get to a place where they're willing to talk about it and listen?
So my impulse, this is such a therapist-y response, but my impulse in that situation when it goes quiet would be to ask, what are you all feeling when I say, you know, when I bring up not flying? And I just feel that emotional experience is like so often the missing link, the missing piece in climate conversations, which tend to be so intellectual. So yeah, bringing it there. And the other thing I'll say is people are ambivalent, right? They both want to fly and don't want to fly. And by only being on the don't want to fly side, then you can kind of push them into the like defending their want to fly. So you can also ask in the conversation, what do you like about flying? What are you afraid of giving up and losing? And you know, just giving them space to articulate those very real feelings. And once you've shown that you're not, you know, that you're like reasonable, that you're empathic to their experience, I think maybe it's going to be a different dynamic.
Thanks so much, Margaret. Do any of the other panelists want to answer that question as well? No, then I'll move on to a question from Alex. And this is directed at Charlie. Charlie, I hope you're really there. I've found traveling on the ground has opened up Australia for me, where I used to fly over it. Have you enjoyed it, Charlie?
Yeah, look, I took off in my big red waste vegetable oil powered fire truck as soon as I made my flight free pledge. And I'd actually been working on converting my truck to run on veggie oil for a while, but it was a great excuse to just start being land based. And there is so much to see in this country. I mean, it's massive. Like you could literally spend your life traveling Australia and never see it all. And that's again something that I've really appreciated. Even in my local area, you know, being back in the southwest of WA, I'm just discovering all these places that were right under my nose my whole life that are like world-class, beautiful campsites and communities and towns and people. And like to me, it's all about relocalizing. You know, the bigger picture here is that we need to come back to our local communities and appreciate what we have at our front doors and not keep trying to run around to the other side of the world to chase that big shiny thing, because everything we need is right here. And if we put our energy into that, then we'll cultivate that and we'll appreciate it more, and we won't need to fly. I mean, that's the ultimate goal for me. But yeah, appreciating the land-based travel has definitely been a part of that.
Anyone else have a comment? No? Thanks so much, Charlie. I appreciate those sorts of things too. This one is from Barbara Pocock. Is it plausible for a federal parliamentarian to do their job without flying? Or is it a case of reduction rather than elimination? Do you have thoughts on reduction versus just stopping? Margaret? No. David, would you like to answer that one?
Well, having worked in Parliament House, I know what they're like. In fact, being an extrovert, I once had aspirations of becoming a politician until that career episode of mine. And having met lots of politicians and worked and argued with them, I made up my mind never to be a politician. Look, we saw last year with the COVID experience how politicians can meet and make decisions via Zoom, via the internet. But I still think they have to get together face to face to get through the nuances and understand each other and just do that argy-bargy stuff and negotiating, which is difficult when you're sort of sitting in front of a Zoom and a computer. You don't get the same feelings. So I think it's a matter of reduction, and I think they could, really significantly reduce the amount of flying they do. They hop on an aeroplane at every chance they can to go around the world and have jollies, at the great taxpayers' expense. That sort of thing can be limited, I believe. But I still think Parliament has to meet face to face. So it's probably a reduction. They could travel by train.
Of course they could. Yeah. Thank you, David. The next question is from Liam Prince. It's for Charlie and Uma, but I think we'll start with Uma because you haven't had a chance to respond. Apart from musicians, what more can music festival organisers, venues, music promoters, managers, organisations, etc., do to promote sustainability in the music industry, particularly around travel? Any good examples? And PS, thank you for your leadership. Uma?
Thank you. Thank you for that question, Liam. I think I'm going to go down a similar route as Charlie in terms of, improving our local communities. So, if I'm talking about travel, the first thing venues and festivals can do is get local musicians, people who don't have to travel from far. And I come originally from Castlemaine, which has a lot of music. I'm really lucky, and we often have local musicians, and I think it's lovely. It's a much better vibe almost. So that's the first thing, get local musicians. And in terms of how they could reduce travel with attendees, I'd really like to see festivals, I don't know how they could do this, but something to do with ticket prices, or you get something if you're traveling not by plane. I was talking with Mark a while ago about businesses doing something with their employees when they go on leave. They have more time if they're traveling not by plane. So I don't know if we could do something like that with attendees to big festivals like WOMAD. That would be great. What else can I talk about with this question? I'm not sure. I mean, that's what I have to say about the travel side of it. A lot of festivals are getting better with the sustainability side, but I don't know much about that. I might pass it on to Charlie now.
Yeah, great, Uma. And I love that suggestion of incentives for non-flyers. I've actually been to a few festivals that have things like free camping for people who rock up on a bicycle, the cyclist camping or the walk-in camping. Just giving them a little bit of extra love and a bit of extra benefit really encourages people to come in a lower impact way. And also the local music thing is huge here in WA. It's such a unique time right now because in a lot of ways we're the only state that hasn't really been affected by COVID. There was a brief lockdown last week after one person had a bit of a scare, but live music hasn't stopped here. And what's happened is touring acts can't come in and international acts can't come in. So the local music scene is booming, and small local bands who would have maybe been lucky to get a gig at like a small pub on a Wednesday night, previously, are now playing on main stages at the Perth International, not international anymore, but the Perth Festival and Fringe and these bigger platforms that are just empty because they're, were previously kind of reserved for these big international acts, and they're getting the recognition they deserve, and they're fantastic, and it's cultivating that local community. And that's all I keep saying is, like, if we put our energy into local community, then local community thrives and local arts thrive, and we get this rich experience that you don't get if you just import everything and export everything. So yeah, it's been really beautiful to see, and that support here is really strong.
Thanks so much.
And there's also the green music industry. There's a lot of bands now signing on to sustainability initiatives through, I'm not sure exactly what it's called, Green Music or something.
Green Music Australia are
that's the one.
Yep.
My son has a rock band in Canberra, and he just refuses to travel outside Canberra to play.
Great.
Thank goodness for Zoom. This is one for Margaret. I hope you're bearing up all right there, Margaret. It must be really early in the morning or late at night for you. I'm interested to hear speakers, this is from James Whelan. I'm interested to hear speakers' thoughts on how to shift transport behaviours rapidly at a societal scale, beyond individual choices and influencing our direct circle of family and friends.
Yeah, so I do think we've seen some interesting models during COVID. The shift to remote conferences, remote gatherings, that sort of thing is one element, but also the, you know, with urban planning and cities opening up much more road for biking and walking. You know, those are things that can happen, as we've seen, very, very quickly. I think, and the climate mobilization advocates for hard limits to fossil fuel use. So, for example, a ban on the sale of new internal combustion engine cars, and yeah, hard limits on flights. So I don't know exactly what the mechanism should be. Potentially, yeah, I mean, in the UK, they talked about a tradable carbon equivalent program, which is, you know, like a type of fair shares rationing, the idea that no one, you know, just deserves to emit as much carbon as they want, but we all should all be within certain limits. So yeah, I mean, it's a huge issue, but there's a lot of really exciting stuff going on. The last thing I'll say, because I'm always interested in changes that can happen really quickly. And so another really interesting one is bus rapid transit, where in Bogota, Colombia, for example, they have a very advanced system where the buses have totally dedicated lanes. So taking a bus that's going to go on a highway, for example, is a faster way to go than driving, because has all the traffic. And they have like entry and exit that are more like a subway. You pay, then you enter the loading area, so then you get on the bus very quickly. So again, it's not new technology necessarily, though one would hope the buses become electric as soon as possible, but it's just a new utilization strategy of the infrastructure we already have.
Thanks so much, Margaret. A related question, and Mark, I'm using my power to go over a little bit, is from Bernie McComb, and I'd like to direct this at David. If Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane ranked among most profitable in world airline industry, how can we get fast train alternatives? How about separate accounting emissions for each mode of transport to draw attention to aircraft, especially how much worse at altitude?
I like what Margaret mentioned about the carbon limit on people. I think that someone, I think came from the US, Margaret, was talking about a carbon credit card. When you bought something, you paid for it with your money and you put your carbon credit card in, and it took off from your annual allowance, if you like. And you got to the limit where your credit card went over for carbon. They said, sorry, you have no more carbon credit. Then you had to go and buy extra credits. So it forced you to look for carbon-free products. Yeah, Canberra, Sydney and Melbourne, I think, is one of the most intense flight routes in the world. BZE, I was on the board of BZE for 6 years, and we produced the very fast train report, the plan for Australia. And we showed how economical that was compared with other previous work that had been done by the Commonwealth, for instance. I think it was a $30 billion reduction in the Commonwealth's price. There's been a lot of support for it, but nothing is happening. And I think it gets around to just the demand, the bums on seats. Way back in the, I don't know, it was the 80s, I think, I worked with the Very Fast Train project back then, which we mapped out the entire, with Maunsell consultants, we mapped out the entire route. It's been around for a long time, but it just hasn't got the traction yet in terms of the economics. And, you know, I think we could do it. I wish to God we could do it, but politicians are just resisting.
I'd like to thank you all so much for your contributions and wonderful answers. And I'm so glad this is being recorded so that we can go back and listen to it again and again. Now I'll hand back to Mark.
Thanks, Margaret. Thanks, Helen. Sorry. Yeah, on that last one with the high-speed rail, there's it's an interesting example of how to look at it using Margaret's emergency mode versus sort of normal mode outlook. Like in normal mode, yeah, the economics of high-speed rail are sort of kind of prohibitive. The market determines the sort of the criteria, but in emergency mode, where transport, that emissions-free transport becomes a part of the single priority of economics and politics, then amazing transformations are possible. Witness what's happened under COVID in terms of changes that previously before weren't considered sort of serious, so that have given sort of in an emergency mode for infection from the virus. We've made a lot of changes that will persist. Yeah, so I just wanted to kind of throw that in there at the end. So yeah, thanks Helen again, and thanks everyone, especially our panelists, Margaret and David, Ulma and Charlie, for your stories, your insights and contributions today. We hope they've been provocative and inspiring. And thanks to the Sustainable Living Festival for enabling the webinar. You can get in touch with the Flight Free crew with any questions of yours that we didn't answer today by replying to a follow-up email we'll send all participants tomorrow. And we'd love your feedback on our campaign as well. And thanks also in advance for responding to, we're going to have there's a short post-webinar survey that'll pop up on your screen after you quit the webinar. It won't take a moment. Thanks for filling that out. And one last thing, please check the chat now for links that have been sort of posted during the webinar, including to the Flight Free pledge, to the Flight Free Australia sort of YouTube channel, where we'll upload this webinar when in a day or two, and also to the important and recent climate reality check document from the Breakthrough Centre, from which I sourced my introductory total global warming sort of context statements. And if you're interested in finding out more or even joining the Flight Free crew, we'd love to hear from you. I'm just going to put up share screen now with the link to, and thanks again for logging in, and let's get to work.